Now, there's a very widespread belief that on a free market, absent government controls, that there's a natural tendency for a consolidation of firms into, if not monopolies, into very large firms that control large shares of the market, and that the larger a firm gets, the more powerful it gets, the easier it is to become even bigger, and there's basically a feedback loop where the big fish get bigger and bigger and bigger and keep eating the smaller fish until you only end up with a few fish. Now, it is true that this is a widely held belief, and it is also true that this has been a widely held belief for a long time. So if you go back to the Progressive Era, many people were very certain that this was the case, that big business, that the trusts, as they used to say, were aggregating a greater and greater share of the market to them, and that logically, eventually, would they not all take over at least their respective industries. And this has been used as an argument for government intervention in the marketplace. However, the truth of the matter is that this isn't the case. Empirically, it wasn't the case in the Progressive Era. The fact that there were some firms that were becoming very big didn't really prove anything, because there are many other firms that were also becoming not as big, but big and growing to the point that in proportion, even the big firms weren't taking over entire markets. So for instance, Standard Oil Standard Oil was a pioneer. I mean, it was the first, like one of the first major oil companies. So obviously, as the first company, it was the only one for a time. However, and it was very successful. It grew to be a very big company. However, it actually had been losing market share for like 20 years prior to any government trust busting that occurred. And the fact that John D. Rockefeller became very wealthy does not prove that John D. Rockefeller was taking over the entire oil industry, because there are many other people who became very wealthy in competing firms. Now, it is true that larger firms do often have certain advantages. There is such a thing as economies of scale. However, there are also disadvantages to larger firms. A, they have a harder time calculating costs. It's a lot more to manage, which means it's a lot easier for something to be mismanaged. And B, the large amounts of capital they tend to have make it very difficult and expensive to change. And actually, this actually did happen to Standard Oil. Standard Oil was this very large oil company, but it was based primarily in the northeast United States, so Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia. That's where all of its refineries were. That's where all of its production came from. Its transportation was predicated on using the railroads in the eastern United States. When oil fields began to open up in other parts of the country, especially in Texas, but also several of the western states, Standard Oil did not have the capital and the necessary equipment to take advantage of these fields. And this is primarily where they lost most of their market share. Not because the slice of the oil pie was any smaller, it was because there's a whole lot more oil being produced, and they did not have any part of it, at least for many decades. And actually, they didn't have a part of it until after the government started regulating them, oddly enough. I've also heard it put, if you look at a company like Domino's, if tomorrow Domino's decided they wanted to switch to a newer, better oven, then they would be having to change thousands and thousands of ovens, and it would take probably several years and enormous amounts of money. Whereas if you were a single pizza place and you needed to switch to another oven, it would be logistically many thousands of times easier. And so, even though they have economies of scale, larger companies are less adaptable in the short run, and when they do make mistakes, they tend to be far more expensive. So the other thing that occurs, especially on a free market, is if indeed you are being very profitable, this acts as a signal to other firms to enter the market. And this means that you will never have a situation, or maybe not never, but it's hypothetically very unlikely that you would have a situation where only one firm could predominate, because if it's doing so well, then others will see this and say, let's enter that field as well. And during the Progressive era, even though there were large firms, there are always new firms entering it. So if we look at like the auto industry, in the first 10 years of the 20th century, usually had more than 100 automobile companies being founded every single year. Now it's true most of them failed, but some of them didn't fail. And so that means every year you had a number of new successful automobile companies. And you didn't have something like the big three. You had the big six, the medium size 85, and the small 400, or arbitrary numbers there. But you didn't get the big three until you had regulations that prevented free entry. And so by the Depression, at least, and certainly after World War II and during World War II, it was almost impossible for somebody else to start an automobile company. And so the fact that we have big three now, people seem to think, oh, well, that's a natural result of a free market. You get the Fords and the GMs become the best. They outcompete everybody else. They buy out everybody else or drive them out of business, and eventually there'll only be one, or at least an oligopoly. However, that's not an accurate description of what occurred at all. You had regulations that basically prevented new firms coming. Ford can buy out and bankrupt 100 company, or 50 companies a year. But if 100 companies a year are joining the market, then they'll never get rid of them all. No matter how many they destroy, more can come in. If you restrict companies entering the market, however, well, then all of a sudden you do have a situation where you can see a consolidation, and likely you will eventually. I mean, if no new firms can enter, then eventually you will see a consolidation. Of course, that's what we've seen in the big three / now the big two / really the only big one. And I think the best way to see profits is that they are very erosive. They don't confer a special benefit. When you earn a profit, that doesn't mean that next year you'll earn a bigger profit, and so on and so on and so on, and exponentially end up taking over. Profits attract competition, and this competition is very erosive. It's very hard to even retain, to even break even. The only conceivable way that you could always outcompete, I mean, it's conceivable. You could be a very smart manager, a very smart businessman, or you could be very lucky and you could do very well. However, conditions in the market are never identical. They're always changing. Now, usually they don't change really drastically, although sometimes they will. And at some point, some other firm is going to guess more correctly than you on future conditions. And when they do, they will gain market share. So the only conceivable way that a firm could always gain in market share and always beat its competitors would be if it was able to always outsmart, always predict better than all the other competition. And this is why it's interesting, because nobody is that superior that they can always outcompete all their competitors. I mean, you might have one company that is really dumb, and so you might be able to consistently outsmart that company, but which also probably means that company won't be around for very long. However, the idea that John D. Rockefeller is going to outsmart everybody else forever is silly, and that's what he would need to do to maintain his market share and his high profits on a free market. And it's actually interesting, because the people who usually are afraid of this sort of thing say they're egalitarians, and yet the only way the situation they describe could ever come about would be if there was a race of supermen who could outcompete everybody else all the time. So what we've seen instead is that the freer markets that we had before were not creating consolidations. There were attempts at consolidations. Many firms attempted to form cartels. Many companies attempted to buy out all their competition, and they all failed. It was interesting in the progressive era, even though there was this widespread belief that consolidation was inevitable. When the big capitalists got together, all they would do is complain about how hard it was to compete and how they were kept losing money and how it was almost impossible to make a profit anymore. And their catch-all solution was to go to the government and have the government step in to regulate away their competition and to consolidate the gains that they had made so far. And that is exactly what happened. Now, that has happened at different times depending on the industry. And the industries where it's happened the most and the longest are the least competitive and the least serviceable. So oil, for instance. I mean, oil refining, you can't, it's against the law for anybody else except the companies that already are doing it to refine oil. But in certain industries, it still hasn't happened yet. So there isn't, this hasn't happened to the computer industry yet. So the computer industry sees falling prices every year, even with all the inflation we have. Falling prices and yet exponentially better products. Because they're competing. And if we could see that in all our fields, I mean, could you imagine if we saw that in medical care? I suspect that the cost of you can't know a priori what the actual cost on the market, on a free market, would be, but I would suspect that it would be many orders of magnitudes cheaper and higher in quality than what we have today. So anyway, I just thought I'd touch on that really briefly.